Students, today we are going to discuss the different methods for studying development. We all know development occurs, but we should study development. There are many different ways to study development depending on the aspects of development under study, but the beginning of every study starts with making a hypothesis. So, we will first look at what is a hypothesis and how to make a good hypothesis. A hypothesis is a statement that proposes an explanation to some phenomenon or event. While formulating a hypothesis, you are writing a statement or question relating what will happen after you perform a given experiment. The purpose of a hypothesis is to help create testable parameters through which information can be gained. Example of a hypothesis in education is: would using technology in classes every day make lessons more interesting to students? You will usually be required to come up with a hypothesis as a part of an assignment. Before you begin any research, you should understand what the goals and requirements of the assignment are. This will help limit the scope of your research. Decide a topic based on the limits of your assignment and then begin research. Read about the subject broadly or read any material that was specifically assigned or required by the assignment. This will give you ideas for your hypothesis. You can find information from your textbooks at a library or online for making your hypothesis. The basic formulation for a hypothesis is: it starts with if, then. That means, if I do this, then this will happen. Students, let us now look at the different methods of proving a hypothesis in development studies. First, we will take experimentation. The experimental methods involve manipulating one variable to determine if changes in one variable cause changes in another variable. This method relies on controlled methods, random assignment and the manipulation of variables to test a hypothesis. Lab experiments are very common in psychology because they allow researchers to have more control over the variables. These experiments can also be easier for other researchers to replicate. The problem, of course, is that what takes place in a lab is not always identical to what takes place in the real world. Sometimes researchers might opt to conduct their experiments in the field. For example, let us imagine that a social psychologist is interested in researching pro-social behavior. How he does that? This experimenter might have a person pretend to faint and observe to see how long it takes onlookers to respond. This type of experiments can be a great way to see behavior in action in realistic settings. However, it makes it more difficult for researchers to control the variables. So, what do psychologists do? Psychologists, like other scientists, utilize the scientific methods when conducting an experiment. The scientific method is a set of procedures and principles that guide how scientists develop research questions, collect data and then come to conclusion. Let us see the 4 basic steps of the process. They are formulating a hypothesis, designing a study and collecting data, analyzing the data and reaching conclusions, sharing the findings. Most psychology students will be expected to use the experimental method at some point. Let us see what is cross-sectional research. Cross-sectional studies are observational in nature and are known as descriptive research. Researchers record the information that is present in a population, but they do not manipulate variables. Cross-sectional research can be used to describe characteristics that exist in a population, but not to determine the cause and effect relationships between the variables. These methods are often used to make inferences about possible relationships or to gather preliminary idea to support further research and experimentation. Cross-sectional utilize different groups of people who differ in the variable of interest, but share other characteristics such as socio-economic status, educational background and ethnicity. For example, researchers studying developmental psychology might select groups of people who are remarkably similar in most areas, but differ only in age. What do they gain by doing this? By doing this, any differences between groups can presumably be attributed to age differences rather than to other factors. A cross-sectional study design is used when the purpose of the study is descriptive, often in the form of a survey. Usually, there is no hypothesis as such, but the aim is to describe a population or subgroup within the population with respect to an outcome and a set of risk factors. The purpose of the study is to find the prevalence of the outcome of interest for the population or subgroups within the population at given point of time. Advantages of cross-sectional studies are relatively inexpensive and takes up little time to conduct, can estimate prevalence of outcome of interest because sample is usually taken from the whole population. Many outcomes and risk factors can be assessed. There is no loss to follow up. Disadvantages are difficult to make casual inference, only a snapshot. The situation may provide different results if another time frame had been chosen. The next method we will look into is longitudinal research. This longitudinal research is a type of research method used to discover relationship between variables that are not related to various background variables. This observational research technique involves studying the same group of individuals over an extended period of time. So, what do? Data is first collected at the outset of the study and maybe then be gathered repeatedly throughout the length of the study. In some cases, longitudinal studies can last even for several decades. The benefit of this type of research is that it allows researchers to look at changes over time. It is because it is taking several decades. Because of this, longitudinal methods are particularly useful when studying development and lifespan issues. However, longitudinal studies require enormous amount of time and are often quite expensive. Because of this, these studies often have only a small group of subjects, which make it difficult to apply the results to a larger population. What is the other problem that we will face? The other problem is that participants sometimes drop out the study, shrinking the sample size and decreasing the amount of data collected. There are three major types of longitudinal study. Panel study involves sampling a cross section of individuals. The next is cohort study. This involves selecting a group based on a specific event such as birth, geographic location or historical experience. Retrospective study. This involves looking to the past by looking at historical information such as medical records. Cross-sectional research differs from longitudinal research in the aspect cross-sectional studies are designed to look at a variable at a particular point of time. But what do longitudinal studies do? They involve taking multiple measures over an extended period of time, while cross-sectional research is focused on looking at variables at a specific point. As we are talking about development, we need to know what is observation. Observation is a very important method of studying development, since development involves very slow and subtle factors of human behavior. Observation is a way of gathering data by watching behavior, events or noting physical characteristics in their natural setting. Observation can be overt, that is, everyone knows they are being observed, or covert, no one knows they are being observed and the observer is concealed. The benefit of covert observation is that people are more likely to behave naturally if they do not know they are being observed. However, you will typically need to conduct overt observations because of ethical problems related to concealing your observations. So, how are we going to do the observations? They can be direct or indirect. Direct observation is when you watch interactions, processes or behaviors as they occur. For example, observing a teacher teaching a lesson from a written curriculum to determine whether they are delivering it correctly. So, a direct observation, the observer and the person who is being observed are real. Indirect observations are when you watch the results of interactions, processes and behaviors. For example, measuring the amount of food wasted by a student in a school cafeteria to determine whether a new food is acceptable to them. So, students, when should we use observation for evaluation? When you are trying to understand an ongoing process or situation, through observation you can monitor or watch a process or situation that you are evaluating as it occurs. When you are gathering data on individual behaviors or interactions between people. Observation allows you to watch people's behaviors and interactions directly, or watch for results of behaviors or interactions. When you need to know about a physical setting, setting the place or environment where something takes place can help increase your understanding of the event, activity or situation you are evaluating. For example, you can observe whether a classroom or a training facility is conducive to learning. When data collection from individuals is not a realistic option, if respondents are unwilling or unable to provide data through questionnaires or interviews, observation is a method that requires little from the individuals from whom you need data. How do you plan for the observations? Determine the focus. Think about the evaluation questions you want to answer through observation and select a few areas of focus for your data collection. For example, you may want to know how well a curriculum is being implemented in the classroom. Your focus areas might be interaction between students and teachers knowledge, skills and behaviors. Design a system for data collection. Once you have focused for your evaluation, think about the specific items for which you want to collect data and then determine how will you collect the information you need. There are three primary ways of collecting data through observation. These three methods can be combined to meet your data collection needs: recording sheets and checklists. Recording sheets and checklists are the most standardized way of collecting observation data. These forms are typically used for collecting data that can be easily described in advance. Example, topics that might be covered in a lesson. Field notes are the least standardized way of collecting observation data and do not include preset questions or responses. Then what do field notes do? Field notes are open-ended where data that can be written or dictated onto a tape recorder. Time your observations appropriately. It is critical that you schedule your observations so you are observing the components of the activity that will answer your evaluation questions. So, this requires advanced planning. Let us now go through the advantages of observation in detail. We are able to collect data where and when an event or activity is occurring. Observation method does not rely on people's willingness or ability to provide information and allows you to directly see what people do rather than relying on what people say they did. What are the disadvantages of observation? Observation method is susceptible to observer bias. This method suffers from Hawthorne effect, that is, people usually perform better when they know they are being observed, although indirect observation may decrease this problem. Observation can be expensive and time consuming compared to other data collection methods, and it does not increase your understanding of why people behave as they do. Now, let us see what a case study is. In developmental study, a case study or a case report is a descriptive or explanatory analysis of a person, group or event. An explanatory case study is used to explore the cause of certain events. Now, let us look into the definition. The definition of case study. It is as follows. Case studies are analysis of persons, events, decisions, periods, projects, policies, institutions or other systems that are studied historically, holistically by one or more methods. Case study research can mean single or multiple case studies, and they can include quantitative evidence, relies on multiple sources of evidence and benefits from the prior development of theoretical propositions. Case studies should not be confused with qualitative research, and they can be based on any mix of quantitative and qualitative evidence. Now, let us come to questionnaire. What is a questionnaire? I am sure you will be aware of a questionnaire. It is a research instrument consisting of a series of questions and other prompts for the purpose of gathering information, and this information is gathered from respondents. Although they are often designed for statistical analysis of the responses, this is not always the case. Questionnaires have advantages over some other type of surveys in that they are cheap, do not require as much effort from the questionnaire as verbal or telephone surveys, and often have standardized answers that make it simple to complete data. However, such standardized answers may frustrate users. Questionnaires are also sharply limited by the fact that respondents must be able to read the questions and respond to them. Let us go into the type of questionnaires. Structured questionnaire. It has definite and concrete questions, is prepared well in advance, initiates formal inquiry, supplements and checks the data previously accumulated, used in studies related to economics, social problems, administrative policies and changes. What is an unstructured questionnaire? Unstructured questionnaire is used at the time of the interview, acts as the guide for the interviewer, is very flexible in working, used in studies related to group of families or those relating to the personal experiences, beliefs, etc. A questionnaire can also be divided as follows, depending on the nature of the questions therein. Open-ended questionnaire. Respondent is free to express his views and ideas. This is used in making intensive studies of the limited number of cases. Merely an issue is raised by such a questionnaire. It does not provide any structure for the respondents to reply. The questions and their orders are predetermined in the nature. Close-ended questionnaire. Responses are limited to the stated and alternatives. One of the alternatives is simply yes or no. Respondent cannot express his own judgment. What is a mixed questionnaire? Mixed questionnaires, questions are both closed and open-ended, used in the field of social research. Pictorial questionnaires, used very rarely. Pictures are used to promote the interest in answering the questions, used in studies related to the social attitudes and the prejudice in the children. Data collection. Students, we will now look at data collection methods in development. Personal interviews. This will give an authentic report, that is face to face, involves trained interviewers visiting people to collect the data using questionnaire. It is a good approach for ensuring a high response rate to a sample survey or census, and trained interviewers gather better quality data. However, there are some disadvantages to this approach. Respondents may not always be available for interviews, and the travel cost of the interviewers could be high. The next is computer assisted personal interviewing. This is called as CAPI. This is also a form of personal interviewing, but instead of completing a questionnaire, the interviewer brings along a laptop or handheld computer to enter the information directly into the database. This method saves time involved in processing the data as well as saving the interviewer from carrying around hundreds of questionnaires. However, this type of data collection method can be expensive due to the basic requirements as laptop and the interviewer to have computer operating skills. Now, let us come to telephone interviews. Telephone interviews involve trained interviewers to collect information and data over phone. This method is quicker and less expensive than face-to-face interviewing. However, only people with telephones can be interviewed. About 98% of the Canadian population and the respondent can end the interview very easily. Next is computer assisted telephone interviewing, which is called CATI. This is a type of telephone interview, but with the interviewer keying in respondent answers directly into the computer. What does this do? This saves time involved in processing data, but can be expensive to set up and requires interviewers to have computer and typing skills. Now, let us see the internet. The growing popularity of the internet brought a major shift in electronic data reporting. The choice of method depends on various factors: complexity and length of questionnaire, sensitivity of the requested information, geographical dispersion of survey population, cost and time frame. Often, the most satisfactory collection strategy uses a combination of methods. For example, mail surveys have proven to be quite efficient when designed as a follow-up for these who did not respond by telephone interview. Conclusion: whatever method the researcher chooses for his or her study in the development, he or she has to make sure that the data collection is ethical. Some of the principles involved in data collection in studying development are: protection from harm. The subject under study in the child development is often an underage minor, and as such he or she should be protected from any kind of harm from the results of study. Often there are many legal restrictions that the researcher will need to follow. Informed consent. It is always good practice to get the consent of the subject being studied and to get this consent in writing for the protection of both the person being studied and the researcher when the result of the research are being published. Privacy. Since developmental study is related to very personal matters, the privacy of the subject being studied should be protected at all costs. What do we do with the knowledge of results? In the case study of adults and even sometimes the teenagers who can understand the results of the study, it becomes the duty of the researchers to convey the results to the subjects so that they take any remedial measures for the problems. Beneficial treatments. In case researchers identify any problem, he or she should also suggest and support the subject to take any beneficial treatments for the problems identified in the research. Thank you.